2018, the 100th anniversary marking the end of the Great War, a war that saw over 650,000 men and women serve, and at a time when Canada had less than 8 million citizens, World War I would be the cause of over 66,000 deaths and 170,000 wounded. The conflict took a great toll on many communities like Parry Sound. Our town in times of war. It's 1914. Canada goes to war. The town of Parry Sound is buzzing with excitement. The men, young and old, find their sense of duty to enlist and embark on what many believed was an adventure.
Like the rest of the country, Parry Sound was quite enthusiastic about the war. Technically, you had to be 18 to sign up, but in reality, some of them signed up early, and the recruiting officers kind of turned the other cheek. If they looked like they might be 18, that was okay. And for them, it was an adventure. A lot of them, it was an adventure. For some of them, it was just a job. Economic times were tough in the few years before the war. And of course, patriotism was a big part of it as well. So it was kind of a mixture of all of those three things. For some of them, it was a free trip to Europe. This is a time when most people would never go more than 60 miles away from where they were born if you lived in a rural area. And now all of a sudden, you're being sent over to France. You're going to be fighting, but people didn't have any clue as to how bad the fighting would be. There were less Canadian nationalists and more nationalists or imperialists and focused on us playing a big role in the British Empire. The other thing I would add is that in the entire country, people kind of had a naive view of what a world war was. There really hadn't been a world war for 100 years. No one alive had experienced one. And many Canadians reacted enthusiastically. They were talking about showing the Germans who's boss and having the soldiers home by Christmas.
This included 23-year-old Roy MacFie, the oldest of 7 children. Born and raised on a farm near Dunchurch, Ontario, his brothers Arthur and John would also join. MacFie would become a corporal.
My dad was in the horse transport of the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion. His parents were pulling strings such as the meager supply of strings that would be available on a farm near Dunchurch in the wilds of Parry Sound district, because Dad had been there since the beginning. And they thought, well, we've sent 2 more. One's dead, and we want somebody to come home. But of course, it didn't work. He was one of the letters in that book. He felt guilty about leaving, but he assured his folks that he'd be home for Christmas. He spent the next 5 Christmases in Europe before he got a Christmas at home.
We have signed on for a year at least in 6 months after the war is over, if needed. There are 15,000 men here now, and hundreds of men in teams drawing loads of tents and supplies from daylight to dark. I guess there are about a dozen or more trainloads of men arriving every day with trains as long as ever they can draw. Well, I am not sorry yet for coming, although I may be before I am through. But don't you worry about me, for I wouldn't be contented if I had stayed at home. I would be in misery when I would hear about what they are doing here, and I would want to be with them.
Of course, no one really understood what this war would mean, what it would truly cost.
There really wasn't an understanding of how bad the war would be. There wasn't an understanding that the technology had changed that was going to make the number of deaths in war go up dramatically. The traditional European warfare did have that reputation of being a gentleman's war, smaller number of casualties because the guns were so inaccurate. But by World War I, rifles had developed, which were very accurate and deadly at a long distance. On top of that, we now had machine guns. Machine guns were going to increase the amount of deaths in battle tremendously. And another thing people often don't think about, but the railway. The railway was important because now you could move huge numbers of troops and huge amounts of their supplies very quickly. You know, the French were afraid that there were going to be a million Germans on their border within 10 days of the war starting. That wasn't possible prior to the 1850s. So now the sheer numbers of men that could be moved, the supplies you could get to them, and the deadliness of the weapons was like a perfect storm for increasing the level of casualties in warfare in World War I.
There was a lot of wounded Belgian and French soldiers in all the towns in England now. There was some came here in an auto yesterday, and we're talking to the boys. Must be an awful war by the stories they tell. Well, I think I'd better quit this, or you'll think I think of nothing but my own experiences. I tell you, I often think of all of you and wish I was back there again, but I haven't been homesick. Yet. I'm getting afraid that we will ever see the front. Now I hope we get to France. Anyway, I would hate to go home without seeing some of it. All the towns and cities in this country are full of wounded soldiers, and every time I see them, it makes me wish I could get right away to the front and get at it too.
Parry Sound saw major changes during the war, much like the rest of the country. In one sense, war was good for the economy.
The town boomed largely because of two munitions factories set up in Nobel. It belonged to CIL, and they actually opened one plant early in the war, and then they opened another one and ran it on behalf of a British company. And it really, I mean, they employed several thousand people. It was quite an operation. And they were an important part of the supply chain that sent munitions to the war front.
So I have a sister who's a munition worker, eh? That sounds fine, in a way, but I wish everybody in the world would stop making munitions altogether. If I thought you had a hand in making the noise that we had to go through in the last place we were in, I would give you a talking to when I get home.
The noise. Because they were being shelled, and as they were going up, they were passing through the Canadian artillery, or the Allied. And those guns were firing, and he talked about how it would scare the horses, just going by a great big 9-inch long-range artillery gun. And he said they seemed to just do it on purpose. When you get abreast of them, they'd fire, and of course the poor horses would panic. He was taking stuff up for 5 days or 6, several trips a day. He talked about it was just a trail made out of old rubble from destroyed buildings, and how if a horse got off in the mud, he talked about seeing one with just his head out of the mud, and waving its head back and forth, and an officer came along and Dad got him to shoot the horse. Another place where the mules were plodding over a dead man's back, and somebody who had been shot fell on the trail and was just worked into the landscape, and how they had to go up over that every time they went up. The Germans started shelling them with a string of mules, and he thought best, there was a broken gun, so they got under this gun for shelter. And then coming back also down the line was one officer leading a wounded officer. He'd been wounded in the trenches, and he was taking him back. And Dad, being the kind gentleman that he was just a corporal, low. And of course they had to pay due respect to officers, and he thought it his duty to vacate his spot under the gun so this wounded officer and his escort could get under the gun for shelter. And just as Dad stepped out on the road, he got hit with shell fragments, shrapnel, and had to be taken out. He was hit in the shoulder and the arm.
I got patched up, and in 2 or 3 weeks I was back again. They sent me to Treville on the seacoast for convalescence, but we used to have to do piquet down in the town. Oh gall, I hated that. Walking around looking for drunk soldiers, I didn't like it there. So I did something and got up before the colonel. I said I wanted to get back to my battalion. Well, he said, we can do that.
The Battle of Passchendaele took place from July to November 1917. The Canadian Corps joined the fighting in October. More than 4,000 soldiers died in the fighting, and almost 12,000 were wounded.
You can imagine everyone would be just every day dreading getting a telegram about one of their loved ones in the war. That was, I think, probably the hardest part for people back home, is waiting for news. They'd be waiting to get that letter to know that their soldier was safe. They would be dreading getting that telegram that told them something had happened. Again, that's difficult to imagine the emotional stress that must have been for people who actually had someone over there fighting. In fact, when you look at the numbers, I did some quick math, and Parry Sound lost more men on a percentage basis than Canada as a whole did. In fact, we lost 3.5 times more men. For a town of our size, at the time in the middle of the war, it was about 5,000 people, and we lost 144 soldiers. So I can't imagine a small community like that, how devastating that would have been to, in a course of 4 years, lose 144 young men from the community. So it must have been absolutely devastating for the community. The local paper reported that on November 11th, when the war officially ended, because of the time difference, it was 5:30 in the morning, they started the celebrations in Parry Sound, and apparently there was a huge bonfire lit at Seguin and James Streets, and the public came out and people were celebrating, and the church bells were ringing and the fire bell was ringing. You can imagine what this would be like for people. I mean, their greatest hope for 4 years was the war ending. And they had all contributed somehow to the war effort, whether at home or as a soldier. And so this was the culmination of 4 years of their hopes and dreams of the war finally coming to an end.
My mother was a fierce patriot. She just thought the war was a glorious thing, and had a brother who lost an eye in France, and I think she had set her cap to have a heroic war veteran. During all this, my dad was twice decorated for bravery in the field, awarded the military medal, as they called it, for lower troops below the officer horizon. If he'd been an officer, he would have got the Military Cross, which was even glitzier. But he was twice decorated, military medal and bar. So that she happened to be at the farm the summer Dad came home. Of course, there was just what she wanted, and she got him. And that was my mother, and she had her hero.
We've had now 3 trips to Europe for special events, and the last one was for the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which was really Canada's most important battle in World War I. And what we do is we have about 40 kids. We go to Europe for this, this commemoration, but we do more than that. Before the students go, they each adopt a local soldier who was killed in one of the wars. And they go on through the internet. They're able to research this soldier through the National Archives. They find out things like where they lived in Parry Sound, where they went to school. Very often, some of our students have been able to make contact with relatives of the soldier. And then we make sure on the trip that they get to visit his grave. It personalizes the experience for the students. They get to know, they feel like they know this soldier.
I'm going to connect this a little bit. When we came home, we did a little bit of a presentation about how it affected us and different things that we learned about the trip and what we learned while we were on the trip. And I wasn't going to talk, but Mr. Lund asked me to, and so I said fine. But it brought me to tears even then, and it had already been like 2 months after the trip, about. But it's so emotional, just, being there, and, you learn a lot about this person, you learn a lot about their life, and you see how hard they struggled or different things that they went through. So when you're there and you're like, you can see their grave finally, you see how, you don't know how it was for them, but you just have that really deep emotional connection to them, and it's like you're mourning someone that you actually knew. And it's really emotional, and I cried a lot. But it's just like you really feel it. Like when you're there, it's just very somber, and it's very heartfelt.
To this day, whenever I tell anyone about what it's like when they visit the graves, I get goosebumps. Like, it's such an emotional thing. Like, it's a privilege as a teacher to be there at a moment like that, to see what they're experiencing, because they'll remember it for the rest of their lives, and it changes them. And I mean, as a teacher, that it's been the most enriching, the most important thing I've done in my career. And I consider it one of the most important things I've done in my life, like to help these kids get that experience, these students, that changes them forever and they'll never forget. I mean, what else as a teacher doesn't get any more important than that? This community, there's something special happening, and I think it started with the trips, but it's bigger than just our trips. Like, this is across the country. I think people have responded in the last 15 years to see that we're losing our veterans, and even the World War II veterans, most of them are gone now. And I think the rest of the public has kind of said, we have to pick up the slack. We have to make sure what these men did and men and women did is remembered. And what we've done locally is we started this program in conjunction with our last trip, where people could sponsor, pay $100 to have a street banner made with a family member who served in one of the wars. And we were astonished. We were thinking we might get maybe 40, on the best case scenario, we'd have 40 people come forward, and in downtown Parry Sound, we would put up maybe 20 banners or something like that. We ended up with 118 people coming forward wanting to sponsor a veteran. And we put up 59 banners. And every single year now, those 59 banners go up in downtown Parry Sound to remember those 118 veterans. And the families were so emotional. The emails I got were incredible, because they told me stories about, they said, my dad never talked about the war, but I always knew he suffered because of it. And he survived the war, and he never got his name anywhere. And now we can remember him, and we can, give him his due finally. And there were families came in from out of town to see the banners when they went up, because they had a family member who they wanted to recognize. So it gave people whose relatives had survived the war, but hadn't really, they felt, been recognized. Now they get their name somewhere and their picture. And I think for the town, it was a really, really important thing. And as an aside, we offered more banners. The town funded us to allow us to get more banners, and we have another 40 banners going up this year. So we're going to have close to 200 veterans are going to be honored every year now in downtown Parry Sound. But it's not just the families, it's also the response of the community, because this was a partnership with the Downtown Business Association, the town, the high school, like the kids from the trip, the Legion, and the local museum.
And as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, we reflect and hope that the remembrance will continue for the next 100 years.
I think it's important to remember, because everything that we have, the way our country's developed since the end of World War II, is because of what these soldiers were willing to do in World War I and World War II. And the soldiers that are willing to take part in peacekeeping missions and things like that. None of what we have would be possible. Our freedom, our peace, our security, our economic prosperity, none of that happens unless we win the wars and unless we prevent other countries from sliding into anarchy. So everything we have, we owe to those soldiers and those nurses and everyone who took part in helping defend us back then. So, I think it's really important that people understand the sacrifices that were made in order for us to have the type of life we have today.
Remembrance Day has always been something very important to me, obviously, because my dad was in the military. So I've always had that respect and that connection to Remembrance Day. But going on this trip just absolutely changed everything. Like, it opens your mind to so much more, and it just makes like Remembrance Day so much more important, I guess. And like, once you go to Vimy, or once you go to one of the cemeteries of the World Wars, it's just like mind-blowing, really. Like, you walk into a cemetery of like, I don't even know how many, there's so many cemeteries there. You walk into one and it's just like rows and rows and rows. And it's just like, it changes your whole perception, because that's just all you can think about on Remembrance Day. You're like really honoring and remembering those people and like how hard they had to fight, and then, you know, them not making it. It's mind-blowing. It's very hard to describe, especially if someone hasn't been there. So my big thing is always recommending that someone goes, because it changes.
4 years, 8 months, and 9 days had elapsed since that hot, hazy August day in 1914, when Roy MacFie caught the stage for Parry Sound, fearful that he would be late for the war.
He was a special sort of man, apparently. And as I say, I'm 93 now, and he's still the finest man I ever knew.